So we are in, for us, what will be our last teaching week of Advent Conspiracy. There's 4 weeks of Advent. We've talked about that. It's historical within the church. The church celebrates Advent for us, but one of the ways we do that is we embrace this thing called Advent Conspiracy. We didn't make it up. It's something that churches do around the country, but basically the reason it's called a conspiracy is what we're conspiring to do is take back the true meaning of Advent and Christmas. And so the 4 ways we look at doing that are that we want to worship fully, right? To make sure that we're centered on Jesus, that our Christmas celebration is centered on Jesus. We want to spend less and give more. We talked about that. We combined those last week. And then the last thing we're going to talk about this week is we want to love all. But I also want to tell you guys, I told you guys that personally I feel like the Lord has spoken some things for us as a church. And one of the big things I feel like God is calling us to is to push back against the busyness of Christmas, that really busyness robs our souls, especially during Christmas, and that to be busy is not the same thing as to be faithful. And that Jesus was faithful and his life was full, but it was never busy. He allowed God to set his rhythms. And I was thinking about that this morning, and I was thinking about kind of Highlands and how Highlands works, and just some of how we even push back against that busyness culture. One of the ways you do that is to be honest and to slow down for other people. And so like Mark being like, that's too high, right? Like that's an honest moment where we slow down for other people, because I don't know about you guys, I don't want to sing real high. It's not good. It's not good for anybody in this room. Right? It's a beautiful thing. I thought it was really cool when Matt and I, we didn't have the right song loaded into Croker's Center today, when they sang that second song. And what happens, but Caleb runs over, Caleb, who helps run slides, runs over and he's like, hey, what do we need? How can I help? Right? Sort of slowing down his own sort of busy mind and thinking about himself to make space for somebody else. I just see it all over us, Helen. And I hope you embrace that. I hope you embrace that part of who we are, which says like we're not going to be so busy in our own minds and so self-conscious that we're not willing to slow down and make space for other people. We're going to eat together today. My encouragement to you, 2 things as you eat together. 1, don't eat alone. Don't eat alone and by yourself, even if you're in a group. If that's not the point of us eating together. We're glad we can feed you, but the big point of that is the community. So don't eat alone and don't rush. Don't rush as you eat today. Enjoy this. This is a moment made for you to take back parts of the true meaning of Advent. All right, so today we're talking about love all, and I want to start this. I ask this question every Christmas, mostly because I feel like I'm getting ideas, and second, mostly because I love movies. I love movies, and we, in our family, one of our things is we always try to watch Christmas movies together. So since Emma's been home, we've really been pounding the Christmas movies. Last night we watched Red 1. It did not get into my top 5. I'm going to go and tell you. It's not a new one for me. There's a real thumbs down in the back. So I'm a big J.K. Simmons fan, but it did not make it for me. And so I want to hear from you guys. I want to hear I want you to share with each other your favorite Christmas movie, or a Christmas movie that you think is overrated. Here's what's interesting to me. Here's something that's interesting about good Christmas movies, whether they're serious or whether they're funny. Good Christmas movies, for the most part, have a message of love, forgiveness, and reconciliation. It's really interesting, like, because you're right, like most of them are not necessarily Christ-centered. Right? But they all have that message. The Christmas season, it seems, is defined by love and forgiveness, definitely more than any other holiday. You don't often people say, come on, you should be more loving, it's Halloween. Right? Why can't you forgive them? It's Arbor Day. Right? You don't hear things like that with other holidays. There's something about Christmas. Similarly, I started thinking about this a few years ago. I think this is similar to, even if we're not Christians, if a person who calls themselves a Christian acts unloving, it's very offensive. There's something in us, whenever we may argue about the Bible or faith or Christianity, there's something that everybody seems to agree upon, at least in our culture. Getting closer to the Christmas story, getting closer to the story of Jesus' birth and Jesus' life and everything that goes along with that, we tend to agree it should make people more loving. Christmas is the story that God loves all. And so that's always, even if you don't know it or say you agree with that story, That's always what celebrating the message of Christmas ends up looking like. So that's why we're talking about loving all as we wrap up our Advent series. Here's your bottom line for today, all right? If you want to stop listening, here it is. This is the takeaway. I'm going to refer to it a few more times, but this is essentially what we're talking about. To fully celebrate Christmas is to let God's love transform us into channels of grace for the world. To fully celebrate Christmas is to let God's love transform us into channels of grace for the world. Loving all is the message of Christmas because it's the message of Christianity. You guys have heard of John. If you've heard of anybody in the Bible, you've probably heard of John. If you've read anybody in the Bible, odds are you've probably read John. John is called by many theologians the disciple of love because the theme of love is at the heart of his gospel. The verse that almost everybody knows, right? John 3:16. For what? God so loved the world. That's why. That's the crux. God loved the world. He gave his son. That's the shortest version of the Christmas story you're going to get. John is the one who in his first letter tells us God's defining characteristic is love. It's interesting. He doesn't say God's defining characteristic is holiness. He doesn't say it's power. He doesn't say it's glory. He doesn't say it's justice. He says it's love. In John's gospel, Jesus' command for his disciples is love one another. So when we think about love, it is easy to think about John. And in 1 John 3, starting in verse 11, John is trying to remind people of this. This is what he says. He says, the central truth, the one that you've heard since the beginning of your faith, is that we must love one another. That's the central truth, John says, about being a Christian. Then he goes on, he says, please do not act like Cain, who was of the evil one. He brutally murdered his own brother, and he asked a good question. Why would he do something so despicable? Why? Because his life was devoted to evil and selfishness. And his brother chose to do what is right. So he goes on, he says, based on that example, he says, brothers and sisters, don't be shocked if the corrupt world despises you. Basically, he's saying like Cain despised his brother. He says, we know that we've crossed over from death to real life because we are devoted to true love for our brothers and sisters. Anyone who does not love lives among corpses. Everyone who hates other members of God's family is a murderer. Does a murderer possess a beautiful life that never ends? No. John's being real matter of fact here. A lot of times we'll ask ourselves, well, how do you know if somebody is? How do you know if somebody's following Jesus? How do you know if somebody's fully celebrating Christmas? And John's being really clear about it. He says, we know what true love looks like because of Jesus. He gave his life for us, and he calls us to give our lives for our brothers and sisters. And so if a person owns the kinds of things we need to make it in the world, but refuses to share with those in need, is it even possible that God's love lives in him? My little children, don't just talk about love as an idea or a theory. Make it your true way of life and live in the pattern of gracious love. And then he wraps this up, this whole section in verse 23. He says this, my command is clear. Believe in the name of the Son, Jesus the Anointed, and love one another as he commanded. Love. That's the message. Love God, love others. That's the shorthand. But it is easy to forget to love, isn't it? It is easy to forget when we feel pressed. It is easy to forget when we feel embarrassed. It is easy to forget when we feel disappointed. Heck, it's easy to forget when we feel tired and hungry. And then, of course, there's that pesky thing of other people. Right? Christmas is full of them. And they make it hard to love. You're like, I'm trying to love you. You stop wiggling around and being difficult and doing things I don't like and being someone who doesn't seem very lovable. And we have all these good reasons to not love. At the same time, remember, to fully celebrate Christmas is to let God's love transform us into channels of grace for the world. So we're going to break that down into those two parts, right? Let God's love transform us, and then what does it mean to be channels of grace to the world? So that first part, transform us. How do we let God's love transform us? So I'm not very smart, but I love to read smart people. And one of the things I love to think about is neurology, right? Like I love to think about the way the brain works and the power of the brain. And I think that's biblical because Romans tells us that we're transformed by the renewing of our minds. That as our minds change, we act differently. That there's a power that happens when God renews our mind. And so one of the things that they've learned recently, fairly recently, in neurology, we're talking science recently, it's always a relative term, but one of the things they've learned fairly recently is we understand everything through narratives. We actually process everything through narratives. Even like singular words, we process through some sort of narrative. That's the way that our brain works. We don't think in facts, we think in narratives. And so part of the reason we don't love all is because we have a different narrative. Because we don't have a narrative of loving all. We don't have a narrative of being loved. We need a personal story of loving all. But mostly what we're told, and some of you will resonate with this because I know what you do and what you think about, and most of what we live in is a narrative of pain rather than love. Research has shown that people tend to remember negative or traumatic experiences more vividly than positive experiences. I was going to ask you guys, I felt like this was a bridge too far. You can say it a little much if you want to. But I was going to ask you guys, I was going to say, think about what do you remember that people told you positive as you were growing up? And what are the negative things people told you as you were growing up? And you will always, almost always, I'll say because somebody's going to raise their hand. I was a youth pastor. I know how that goes. Almost always, you will remember the negative things people said or did to you much more vividly than any positive things, right? It's called negativity bias. It's the way our brain works, and it's actually thought to be an evolutionary adaptation because that helped our ancestors avoid danger and stay alive, right? If they remembered negative things more vividly, they would stay away from negative things more. So it wasn't as evolutionarily advantageous for them to remember positive things, but it's just something that we've held on to. Here's the biggest problem with that, is that trauma, stress, and strong emotions distort our memories. Some of you guys have heard me talk about this. If you don't know about it, I'm not going to go into it today, but you should look up the study they did with this related to 9/11, where they asked people right after 9/11 to write down their experience of it, and then they came back to those same people 5 years later and 10 years later and to write down their experience of it and how different it was. And all of us would think, I would never forget my experience of something like 9/11. But it's a great example of that. Remembering negative events tends to result in more false memories than remembering neutral or positive events. So not only do we believe the negative and the painful more, we actually distort it, and we don't even remember it accurately. We remember it worse than it is. So that means we naturally live telling ourselves that we are less loved, telling ourselves that God is less loving, and telling ourselves that people are less lovable. That's the narrative that most of us live in. And because we live in that narrative, we tend to opt for an overarching narrative as a culture of power, protection, or pleasure. I did all three pieces by myself, by the way. We tend to opt for power, protection, or pleasure, right? And I want you to think about this. What do you think about which one you opt for? I'm going to go ahead and tell you guys, I opt for power. Right? The world is about power. The world is about oppression. Right? The way that I win is I need more power. I need more control. Right? And if I'm losing, it's because I'm oppressed by somebody else who is powerful. Somebody else is doing something to me. It's not my fault. It's they're doing that. If I could just be better, if I could just be stronger, if I could just be more powerful, then I could win. When I was up at Fort Jackson, one of the hardest things I heard from somebody is we were working on a group project, and somebody said to me, they said, man, you really like to be in control of things, don't you? And I thought, of course I do. Of course I like to be in control of things. But I also thought, I had no idea that everybody else saw that that's what I am. It was embarrassing. But I was like, yeah, why wouldn't I want to be in control? I need to be in control. Right? So that's you. If you're like me and you're like, where you get out of whack is when you're not in control. You know, they say like nobody likes change. And I'm like, I love change that I'm in charge of. That's it. That's me. That's power. That's most ancient religions. They're about power and oppression, and you got to get the power of the God on your side. And that's the only way to get yourself out of oppression. And you get to oppress other people. Right? So there's a narrative of power. There's a narrative of protection. That is not me. That is everyone and everything wants to hurt me. The way I think about that is Nemo's dad in Finding Nemo. You guys remember Finding Nemo? Right? Everything is dangerous. Right? And so for some people, that's the narrative. And for you, if that's you, the way you get out of whack is if things don't go to plan. Is if you can't predict what's going to happen. And then the third is pleasure. Right? And pleasure is just, my life is about feeling good. And when I feel pain is when I feel like when I feel pain is when I feel like I have to sacrifice. I have to sacrifice my world. I have a friend who shared this with me. He said one of the things he realized is that he had one of his kids, and he said they were very difficult for him, and they always came to him with their problems, and he was always their safe space, and it started to make him mad, it started to make him bitter, and then he said, what I realized was this. What I realized was that my God was my own peace and my own happiness. And the reason I was mad at my kid was because they infiltrated my happiness. And so if that's you, if you're like, no, I want everything to be happy, and as soon as somebody comes in and my happiness is out of whack, my world is out of whack, and I can't love you. Right? For me, it's I can't love you if I'm not in control. For protection, it's I can't love you if I can't predict you. And for pleasure, it's I can't love you if you do things that make me unhappy. So those are the types of narratives we end up embracing. But here's the question. What's the truth? What's the true narrative? Right, Jesus says, I'm the truth. That's a big claim. The Bible says Christmas is the expression of the truth of God. Some of y'all remember, some of you guys that are my age and maybe older, if you'll admit, remember a guy named Larry King who used to do interviews? Right? Larry King used to interview everybody. Right? I don't know who his comp would be today. Some podcaster. Joe Rogan, maybe? Yeah. So Larry King used to interview everybody, and somebody asked Larry King way back in the 90s. They said, if you could interview anybody, who would you interview? And Larry King was Jewish. He said, I'd interview Jesus. And they said, why would you interview Jesus? He said, I would ask him if he believed that he was born of virgin birth. Because whatever the answer is, changes or reinforces the world. Right? Christmas is truth, or it's nothing. God's love was never meant to be based on our interpretation of our experiences. God's love was never meant to be based on what we think is happening to us. God's love is fully and finally interpreted by what God has done. That is one of the most incredible foundational parts of Christmas. God's love was meant to be experienced as a concrete fact in history. That's what Christmas says. God said, I don't want you to wonder if I love you. I want to step into time so that you will always, no matter how you feel, no matter if you feel protected or happy or in control or you don't, you will know that there is a point in history that you can look at and say, God is about love and life is about love. And the reason that narrative is so important to embrace is, one, if you embrace the truth, you embrace the most transformational thing in the world. And two, if the truth is love and you embrace it, you will change the world on a level otherwise unknown. There was a guy back in, also in the 90s, I'm going 90s today, sorry, younger people. But in 1997, there was a guy named Rodney Stark. At the time, he was an agnostic. Since then, he has become what he calls a non-organized Christian, whatever that means. He might fit in really well here, but in 1997, Rodney Stark wrote a book. It was called, it's got a long title, all right? But I would recommend it. I would recommend it to anybody interested in studying the history of Christianity. It's called The Rise of Christianity, How the Obscure Marginal Jesus Movement became the dominant religious force in the Western world in a few centuries. Sounds like a page turner, doesn't it? But it's incredible, right? Because he basically went back through as an agnostic and studied the rapid and overwhelming rise of Christianity from this like backwater, like small, oppressed religion into the thing that defined our calendar. And it's interesting because his conclusions were a little different than some others' conclusions. Right? Here's some of the things he pointed out. He said the Christian teaching that God loves those who love him was alien to pagan beliefs. From the pagan perspective, what mattered was the service that the deity could provide, since a God could feel no love in response to that offering. Equally alien to paganism was the notion that because God loves humanity, Christians cannot please God unless they love one another. These were revolutionary ideas. Some other things he points out that Christianity did differently than anybody. He said Christianity provided social services that the government did not. They looked after not only their own, but those outside of their community. Women were elevated in status, contrary to popular belief about what Christianity has meant for women, and contrary to the distortions of what it has meant, is that in early Christianity, women were elevated in status. Within the early Christian subculture, he says, women enjoyed far higher status than did women in the Greco-Roman world. They served as deacons, teachers, church planters, and evangelists, and they were given much more honor and respect than women in pagan subcultures. Wives were also given equal status to husbands. These were revolutionary ideas, driven by the idea that God loves us, so we love all. Christianity offered a coherent culture that was entirely stripped of ethnicity. All were welcome. Mercy was regarded in pagan societies as a character defect. Can you imagine that? We don't even understand that anymore. But it was. Because it involved providing unearned help or relief, it was deemed contrary to justice and therefore irrational. These are the things that embracing God's love for all and becoming agents of God's grace for all did in the early world. That's the legacy of Christianity. That's the legacy of Christmas. Loving all. That's what we're leaving on the table when we refuse love as our personal narrative. We're leaving that kind of transforming power. See, the Christmas story, embracing the Christmas story, it's what John says. John says, what is the command? He says, the first command is this. Do you have full faith in what Christmas says about Jesus and God? Not full, unquestioning belief. There's a lot of stuff that you should look into. Right? If you want to sit down, we can talk about this whole virgin birth thing and what it means. I'm happy to sit down with you and talk about that. That's a tough one. Right? Because FYI, most people tell you they're a virgin and they're pregnant. You should not believe them. But this isn't most people, and it's not most things. So I'm not saying full, unquestioning belief. What I'm saying is full faith in what sending Jesus means about God, and it means about us. That God is love, God is here, and we are loved. To fully celebrate Christmas is to let God's love transform us. Transform us by renewing our minds in what the world is really about. It's not about power. It's not about protection. It's not about pleasure. It's not even about the pain that we've gone through. It is about God loving you so much that He created a concrete moment in history so you would never have to question it, and He died so that you could find a way to love God back. Transform us. Transform us into what? How do we know when we've experienced that change? Right? Because John's really practical about it. Transform us into channels of grace. Our life's response to the kind of love that God gives us at Christmas is never a passive belief. It is never a passive belief. Some people would say, no, like Christianity, it's just believing. That's a lie from the pit of hell. The gospel message is always practiced. And what is it in practice? Love one another. That's it. Love one another. Love all without condition. The Greek word is agapeo, which means sacrificial, unconditional love. Here's what John's saying in that passage that we read. The world is a jealous, selfish, murdering world. What the Bible tells us, what Jesus tells us, what Christmas tells us, is if someone claims to experience the love of God, but continues to embrace and live in that jealousy, that hate, that destruction of other people, then they have not experienced the love of God. I'm not saying you don't lose your temper sometimes. I'm not even saying you don't get angry sometimes. The Bible talks about those things. But to live in and embrace that narrative of the world is totally counter to embracing who Jesus is. How do we know if we're beginning to experience abundant life? How do we know if we're really embracing Christmas? We can love all because God loved us. That's it. We can love all because God loved us. Are you choosing love? Are you choosing love over hate? Are you choosing love over jealousy? Are you choosing love over your own personal preservation? Are you choosing love over condemnation? Are you choosing it for other people? And are you choosing it for you? Are you condemning yourself when God says you've been set free? That is not celebrating Christmas. It is the opposite. And it is just as bad as doing it to other people. And sometimes it's the reason you do it to other people. You have a higher standard of love than how I feel right now. You have a higher standard of love than how I feel right now. One of the easiest ways to celebrate Christmas, forgive somebody. Forgive somebody. And the easy response to that is, well, they don't deserve it. Well, of course, that's why it's forgiveness. Well, I don't deserve it. Well, of course, that's why it's forgiveness. Forgive. Our opportunity as people and as a church is to embrace loving all and to give the greatest evidence that we're really celebrating something different at Christmas than the world has. All right, I got one more question for you guys. I'm going to wrap up. This might be just as controversial as the movie today. Fake tree or real tree? Go. Fake tree or real tree and what? Go. All Christmas trees in a home, or say all, most, say it again, most Christmas trees in a home are fake trees. Right? Because they're not growing anymore. They're not rooted anymore. They're not dialed into their source. They look great. They might even smell good.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're not going to be what a tree was meant to be. Here's the thing. Most of us at Christmas are fake trees. We're cut down. We look good. But we are slowly drying out. Because we are not connected to the source. Might look good, might smell good. But eventually, it's all going to die if we aren't connected into the source. It's one of the coolest things you can do with a cut down Christmas tree that is dried out. You can throw it in the fire. You ever throw it in the fire? It's incredible. It's like, it blows up. It's awesome. I mean, you need to be careful. You need to be careful. We're outside here. Christy, tell them I said you need to be careful. But here's the thing. Here's why it's cool. Here's why it's cool. Because it becomes like the fire. And it becomes fuel for light again. And it becomes something useful again, not just something pretty. So here's the thing that I would say to you. If you're drying out, if you're finding it hard to love, it is hard to take a cut down Christmas tree and replant it. I'm sure you can. I'm sure there are people here that can figure it out. But it's difficult. It is difficult the longer it's been disconnected, the harder it is to tie it back in. It's probably going to die. But if you throw it in the fire, it can be something incredible. And what I would say to you is if you are drying out, just throw yourself into the fire of the love of God. You don't have to become what you once were. You don't have to try to become better or try to reconnect yourself in. Just throw yourself into the fire of the narrative of God's love. Let yourself be consumed by the idea that God loves you. He gave everything for you. That's it. Let that narrative consume the pain. Let it consume the desire for power, the desire for protection, the desire for pleasure. Just let it take it over. You don't have to undo it. Just let God's love consume. When you respond to that invitation this Christmas, when you let the narrative of love live in you so that you can act it out, then you will be a light for something better, something different than you could be. So really, 3 practical ways. We can do 3 practical ways to love all. One of them you can do right here today. All right? So the first one is this. When loving yourself or someone else becomes difficult, retell the story from a place of grace. Retell the story from a place of grace. Stop and say, why is it hard to love me? Well, it's hard to love me because I did this. I had a thing in my life, I've shared it with you guys before, a few years ago, where I just did something stupid and it caused a ton of pain for our family. And it was so hard for me to figure out how to let that go. And so, I went to a counselor, and the counselor said, here's what I want you to do. Figure out a way to she's like, just tap yourself on your chest and tell yourself that, well, what the counselor said was tell yourself that you still love yourself. But I realized that wasn't enough. I realized what I need to do was to tell myself that God still loves me. Every time that comes into your mind, just tap yourself on your chest and say, I know I did this, but God still loves me for it and forgives me. I just changed the narrative for myself. You guys have heard me tell this story 100 times about Brennan Manning. Brennan Manning, who wrote some great books. One of the books he wrote was called Abba's Love. And he tells the story of a nun that it's in Furious Longing that he tells the story. Abba's Love is a good book too. But in Furious Longing, Manning tells the story of meeting a nun who was struggling to heal from some abuse that she had experienced as a child at the hands of her father. And so Manning said to her this. He said, find a quiet, secluded place every morning for the next 30 days. Sit in a chair, close your eyes, upturn your palms, and pray this one phrase over and over. Abba, I belong to you. Abba, I belong to you. Abba is the Greek word for dad. Father, closeness. Some people say dad. Abba, I belong to you. After the 30 days, Manning got a letter from the woman, and she said her heart was being healed. She had forgiven her father, and she would enter peace for the first time. When loving yourself or someone else becomes difficult, retell the story from a place of grace. Second thing is this. Ask friends for help. This is the one you can do today, and this is the one that almost all of us will not do. Ask friends for help rethinking your story. You cannot change or grow alone. Where was she? Rebecca. What Rebecca said, right? Joy in a choir. Right? You cannot change or grow alone, and you weren't intended to. Solitary confinement is punishment in our prison systems. It is not relief for you. You need friends. You need family. It's okay to be an introvert. Okay? It's okay to say I need time alone. Right? But it is not okay to confine yourself away from the help of others. That's a health decision. Make it. And if you can't make it, you need to deal with why. Right? Here are 2 sentences I'm going to give you. For those of you who don't know how to talk to people about deeper things, I'm going to give you 2 sentences you can fill in the blank. Right? The first one is this. I need some help thinking through blank. Sit at your table today. Think about that. Ask the people that you're sitting with today. Say, hey, I need some help thinking through blank. I need some help thinking through this thing that's happening at work. I need some help thinking through this thing that's happening in my family. I need some help thinking through this thing that I've noticed about myself. Here's another one. If that one's too deep for you, here's another one. I just don't think I could ever blank. I just don't think I could ever blank. Somebody in this room this week, I was dumb enough to sit down and say, I think I need to get better at my golf game. And here's what I'm going to do. And they were loving enough to look at me and say, that ain't going to get your golf game better. You need lessons. And I was like, man, don't tell me what I need. But they were right. Right? I didn't know I was being vulnerable in that moment. They sure did. They took advantage of it. But I think I would have said before that conversation, I don't know. I don't think I could ever get better than this. And that's a silly example. But I don't think I can ever Blake. All right? I need some help thinking through Blake. I don't think I can ever Blake. All right, last thing. I'm finishing up. I know you guys are hungry and want to eat. All right? Last thing is this. Love geographically this Christmas. Love geographically this Christmas. And the reason I say love geographically is because when you love geographically in our city, you end up having to love all. Highlands, most of our work, most of the missions we do, most of the serving we do, most of the giving away we do is within our city limits. And the reason is because we don't want our giving and our loving and our serving to become biased. Does that make sense? Right? You can choose to love people who look like you. You can choose to love people who spit like you, dress like you, smell like you, talk like you, vote like you. But when you look out and you say, okay, geographically, I'm going to love. Who lives next to me? Who lives to my right and my left? Who lives within 5 miles of me? That needs love. I'm going to love them. So love geographically, especially over the next few weeks.